Welcome to the third and final day of the 10th UK PONI Annual Conference. I'm Sam Dudin, the UK Nuclear Policy Research Fellow here at RUSI. I'm also the coordinator for UK PONI, which involves running a writing workshop, which several of this year's presenters attended, coaching presenters for this conference, editing the UK PONI blog called Nuclear Reactions, and editing the UK PONI papers. In the editorial note for last year's PONI papers, I outlined that there were two key characteristics which make this annual conference different from many other conferences. One is diversity of thought. I can't think of any other conferences on nuclear issues which have presentations from such a wide array of perspectives. The second key characteristic is the reliance on emerging experts. I think this is a real strength, and a lot of the best new ideas come from new researchers. As we can see, both these characteristics are present in today's panel on nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and UK national strategy. We're starting with Artúr Hoñich, who will be discussing W762 and whether or not it strengthens nuclear deterrence. Then Ramesh Balakrishnan will make the case for UK missile defense. Following that, Lyndon Burford will outline the impact that nuclear deterrence has on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, despite not being mentioned in that treaty. Finally, Thomas Davis will analyse the potential ramifications of allowing China to build nuclear power stations in the UK. As such, this panel covers both the defence and civil aspects of nuclear, as well as covering deterrence and non-proliferation. As outlined in the programme for today, this panel was originally mixed gender. However, it is now a single gender panel due to one of the participants withdrawing from the conference. Now we'll move on to our first panelist, Artúr Hoñich.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, and I hope you can see my screen right now. I'm honored to be part of this excellent event, and I'm excited to talk about a very timely topic, the new W762 low-yield warhead. This is one of the new capabilities that were outlined in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review, and it was deployed in late 2019 on a few submarine-launched ballistic missiles. According to the estimates of the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Federation of American Scientists, the warhead's explosive power is between 5 to 8 kilotons. So as the chart shows, this yield is approximately half of the Hiroshima bomb. Now, this capability has been debated in the nuclear policy community ever since the NPR first called for its development. In fact, there are two parallel debates which are often conflated. One about lower yield nuclear weapons per se, whether they are dangerous or necessary, and whether the US should have them or not. Clearly, the current administration has taken a side in this debate by developing and fielding the W762. So in this short presentation, I decided to focus only on the second debate, which is specifically about this warhead. I believe that it can be very insightful to step into the exact framework the administration has regarding this warhead and critically examine their logic. Is it possible that we can find flaws in the reasoning even within this framework? To find out, I will first discuss the American perception of the Russian threat that admittedly prompted the development of this warhead. Then I will describe what the US wants to deter against and how that is just one aspect of reality. I will also bring examples of how the warhead is an improvement to Euro-Atlantic security, and I will mention shortcomings. Finally, I will make a few points on what the deployment can mean for the future. In recent years, many in Western national security circles voiced their concern that Russia secretly has an escalate to de-escalate nuclear doctrine. US officials first attributed this concept to Russia in public in June 2015, and eventually this allegation made its way into the 2018 nuclear posture review, where the concept was defined as seen on the slide. However, if we examine Russian doctrine, their capabilities and posture, evidence is inconclusive. Officially, Russian declaratory policy does not mention this, and Russian officials, including President Putin, repeatedly denied its existence. While it is true that Russia arguably has a higher threshold now compared to the turn of the century, which was a period of conventional weakness, but the suspicion about escalate to de-escalate remained. Turning to capabilities, the Russian non-strategic nuclear arsenal consists of around 1,900 warheads, according to the estimates of the Federation of American Scientists. This science and their continued modernization suggest that Moscow does see a role for these weapons. Thirdly, Russian posturing and exercising patterns send mixed signals. Although Moscow maintains that non-strategic nuclear weapons are held in central storage, alarming signs include simulated nuclear strikes in exercises and nuclear signaling during the Ukraine crisis. In sum, it cannot be said with complete certainty that Russia has an escalate to de-escalate doctrine. And this is where worst case thinking comes in, because the capability for that clearly exists. In theory, the Russian non-strategic nuclear arsenal could be used for a limited nuclear strike in a de-escalate mission, even if this is not codified in doctrine. Simply put, doctrines are not automatic, they are not determinative, they are prescriptive. Therefore, hedging against the Russian non-strategic nuclear arsenal is logical, in line with key NATO objectives such as deterring armed attacks and deterring nuclear coercion. So far, the administration's logic is internally coherent, but interestingly, official US justification only mentions a Russian invasion of the Baltic scenario, which does not reflect the complexity of the Russian threat. And if US statesmen do not signal a realization about the variety of possible Russian de-escalation missions, that questions the range of the deterrent goal that the W-76-2 has. In fact, there is a multifaceted discussion in Russian military circles about the utility of lower yield nuclear weapons in escalation management. And a recent report by Michael Kaufman, Anya Fink, and Jeffrey Edmonds presents an excellent overview of this topic. Because in general, Russian military writing suggests that early nuclear use is neither a preferred choice nor a precise description of how Russia would approach escalation management, especially in light of their improved conventional capabilities that provide more flexibility. So Russian military scholarship discusses that limited nuclear use could be demonstrative, for instance, to deter NATO allies from further getting involved in a conflict or to split the US from its allies. However, limited nuclear use could also serve objectives on the battlefield, like generating an operational pause, defeating specific NATO operations, or terminating the war on the whole. So it is important to recognize that the different scenarios could mean different thresholds for Russia, depending on the stakes. For instance, the W-76-2 will hardly be an effective deterrent if Russia feels being cornered so badly that it would use nuclear weapons. Finally, I would like to mention the results of a RAND exercise which war-gamed the defense of the Baltic in 2019. They found that although low-yield nukes are indeed useful in diminishing asymmetries with Russia, as well as to complicate Russian risk calculations, however, with only low-yield nuclear weapons, NATO could not credibly counter Russian advantages in both non-strategic nuclear weapons and conventional forces. So let's now turn to the strengths and certain shortcomings of the warhead. Experts opposing the W-76-2 pointed out that the US already had air deliverable low-yield options. So why is there a need for this SLBM warhead? Well, the Trump administration openly admitted that the existing air-delivered options face issues. They are vulnerable to advanced air defenses, and Russia could also preemptively target the forward deployed bases in Europe. In contrast to that, this warhead is attached to a submarine launched ballistic missile, so it is more survivable, it has better assured delivery. Therefore, the W-76-2 is a more credible capability for the role that the Trump administration wants for low-yield options. And on another note, it also gives the US more political flexibility in terms of its response to a hypothetical Russian limited first strike, because the warhead is not hosted by a NATO ally. Now, one specific counter-argument against the warhead points to the discrimination problem. This refers to the fact that the warhead is fielded on the Trident II missile, which serves as the delivery vehicle for other, much higher yield warheads as well. Consequently, if the Russian early warning system detects a Trident missile launch, they couldn't know what kind of warhead is on the incoming missile. The administration's counter-argument to this is that operational uncertainty regarding the yield of the air-delivered weapon is already present, so the discrimination problem is not unique. That is unquestionably true. Moreover, as Austin Long from RAND pointed out, the indistinguishability of US and UK warheads, UK Tridents, presents the same issue, since the UK also most likely has a lower yield SLBM capability. But the discrimination problem still exists, even though the W762 did not introduce this issue. Thirdly, let's look at targeting, which is another critical point with this warhead. The State Department's background paper argues that the US strategy for deterring limited nuclear war is capacity-based and not target-based. However, if the warhead is intended to be a credible deterrent, there must be appropriate targets in case deterrence fails. For understandable reasons, the US is being ambiguous in this regard, but that does not make the problem go away. If the response to Russian limited nuclear use is aimed at targets inside Russia, that might actually accelerate escalation, regardless how tailored the strike is, because it is highly questionable whether yield differences would mean anything in that case. And of course, Russian deterrence posture is capitalizing on this fear of escalation. Otherwise, targeting a third party like Belarus or the invading Russian units on NATO soil raise additional difficult questions. So decision makers would have to consider what military objectives would really require nuclear weapons use, even if Russia fired first. And these concerns are reflected in the war games that address this scenario. So for example, one by RAND, two others during the Obama administration, and the recent one under Secretary Esper. Turning to the Russian reaction, I would like to make 2 points. Most importantly, we can observe that so far, the Russian reaction is only rhetorical. Neither the political leadership nor experts have called for developing new capabilities in reaction to the W762. This means that they do not perceive a capability gap because of this warhead. In fact, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov stated that this deployment does not erode Russian security. And secondly, Russia is using the deployment in their public narrative as an example of irresponsible nuclear posturing. And along the same lines, Russian declaratory policy is aimed at convincing the US that Moscow makes no distinction between yields of incoming warheads. So even a limited strike against Russia would trigger a full-scale nuclear response. However, it is difficult to believe this claim because if this was true, then this would question the whole purpose of the Russian non-strategic nuclear arsenal. So it is important to see that in their narratives, both sides claim that escalation cannot be controlled, and it is very dangerous to even think about it. But at the same time, both sides invest in capabilities which could potentially enable escalation control attempts. Turning to future prospects, firstly, this new low-yield option in the US arsenal could play a part in the debate on NATO's nuclear doctrine. For instance, this deployment could further undermine the case for forward deployed US nuclear weapons in light of recent anti-nuclear sharing sentiments. Secondly, next to this low-yield SLBM, the NPR also outlined the need for a modern sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, which could be developed in 7 to 10 years' time at the earliest. And the future SLCM leads us to the third point, because the NPR signaled a belief that the development of low-yield capabilities could generate leverage in future discussions on non-strategic nuclear arms control. Of course, I have to admit that in light of the present environment, this is not realistic at all in the short term. In conclusion, Hedging against the Russian non-strategic nuclear arsenal and its potential coercive use is reasonable. However, the variety of Russian de-escalation missions that NATO could theoretically face should be discussed more. Nevertheless, the W-76-2 warhead is indeed a more credible deterrent than the air-delivered low-yield capabilities in terms of assured delivery, survivability, and it most certainly complicates Russian risk calculations. Still, the discrimination problem and dilemmas regarding target selection remain unresolved risks because of their escalation potential. And as my final takeaway, I would like to reiterate that although both sides claim that escalation cannot be controlled, and attempting to do so would lead to catastrophic consequences, both sides develop and maintain capabilities which, beyond their obvious deterrent value, could also be used for escalation control. Thank you for your attention, and many thanks to UK PONI for this opportunity.
Great presentation. Thank you very much for that. It also looks like you've won the competition for how many books can I get behind me, which has put my small bookshelf to shame. Yeah, I thought it was particularly interesting, the points you raised about discrimination, as well as the fact if you've got two sides and they're using different scenarios, that is obviously a concern. Ramesh, over to you.
Thank you everyone for being a part of this presentation, and thanks to the organizers of the UK PONI 2020 annual conference for inviting me to present at this conference. I'm honored and delighted to be speaking to you today on my topic, Euro-Atlantic security and the UK's nuclear strategy in 2040, the case for a robust UK missile defense system. To begin with, let me give you an overview of what I will cover in my talk today. First, I will provide a quick recap of the core elements of ballistic missile defense and its role in nuclear deterrence. Second, I present a brief overview of the UK's nuclear deterrence policy and its current ballistic missile defense posture. Third, I present a futuristic outlook on the potential strategic threat environment that the UK is likely to face in the year 2040. Fourth, I describe the main drivers going forward that would influence the UK's missile defense strategy. Finally, I present 3 strategic options for achieving a robust UK missile defense by 2040 and provide some concluding remarks. So let me give you a quick recap of the state of ballistic missile defense today. Ballistic missile defense has been the holy grail of strategic defense ever since military planners began addressing the need for a missile defense shield for force protection of forward deployed troops during the strategic missile age of the 1950s and 1960s. Two Cold War concepts, nuclear deterrence and strategic stability, are closely intertwined with ballistic missile defense. BMD systems enable states to mount a defensive shield against incoming ballistic missile attacks. States possessing formidable BMD systems retain the capability to attack adversaries in a splendid first strike, thus lowering the bar for fear of suffering from reprisal attacks. It is precisely to avoid this capability asymmetry and the ensuing exacerbation of the security dilemma that led to the US and the former Soviet Union signing the Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty in 1972. The ABM Treaty, which banned either side from developing and deploying such destabilizing systems, led to further arms control measures, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed in 1987, which banned the staging of missiles with a range between 500 and 5,000 kilometers in Europe. BMD systems militate against the deterrent strategy of mutually assured destruction. Although no BMD system is 100% reliable, it nevertheless raises the level of ambiguity with adversaries and complicates their ability to respond to a first strike. In general, deterrence logic dictates that BMD systems erode nuclear deterrence and degrade the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the chief guarantor of strategic stability during the Cold War. While some believe that BMD systems strengthen meaningful arms controls, naysayers contend that BMD would lead to WMD proliferation and weaken nuclear deterrence. BMD systems only gained traction in the 1980s with the President Reagan's Star Wars program, and later under President Clinton, when research and development into US BMD systems were revived. The program made substantial progress under George W. Bush after he abrogated the ABM Treaty in 2001. Under the Obama administration, operational deployments gained momentum both in the US and in Europe when NATO adopted a new BMD strategy based on what's called the European Phased Adaptive Approach at the Lisbon NATO Summit in 2010. Today, the US has operational deployments of BMD systems on the US homeland, several sites in Europe, including Romania, Poland, Turkey, Spain, and in Asia, BMD systems are deployed in Japan and South Korea, and Saudi Arabia and Israel are also sites for BMD systems in the Middle East. Many other countries, including Russia, China, and India, are all actively pursuing BMD programs. So let me move on to the UK's nuclear deterrence strategy as it stands today. So there are four main pillars, as I see it, that make up the UK's nuclear deterrence strategy. First is credible minimum deterrence. Second, the UK maintaining an SSBN fleet as an independent sea-based nuclear deterrent with dependence on the US for the Trident SLBMs. Continuous at-sea deterrence patrol. And also, the UK upholds the principle of mutually assured destruction, that is, mutual vulnerability of nuclear forces on both sides. There's also a calculated ambiguity and risk assessment as part of this nuclear strategy. These precepts have been the cornerstone of Britain's nuclear deterrence strategy. I argue that inducting a BMD platform would fit in within the UK's current nuclear deterrence posture without disrupting its basic tenets. So let me move on to give you a little bit of an overview of how NATO missile defense looks like today. Although the UK has not partaken in NATO's BMD capability, NATO itself has upgraded its so-called active layered theater ballistic missile defense system, or ALT-BMD, which was developed in the early part of the last decade, into a full-fledged integrated air and missile defense capability after it signed up to the US European Phased Adaptive Approach missile defense strategy for Europe. NATO countries have integrated their air and missile defense under a centralized air and missile defense command and control center located in Ramstein in Germany. So today in Europe, you have missile defense systems deployed in Romania, Turkey, and Spain, and are about to be deployed in Poland. And there are talks that other countries might join the EPAA over a period of time as well. Now let me move on to the UK's missile defense strategy as it stands today. As of today, the UK has only shown limited interest in missile defense. Its primary operational role in missile defense stems from a Cold War era intelligence sharing agreement with the US, whereby the UK agreed to host radars at RAF Fylingdales. The radar base was upgraded in 1993, and the UK-US Missile Defense Cooperation Agreement was further strengthened in the year 2003. This agreement is purely bilateral between the US and UK and does not involve any integration with NATO BMD assets. And it goes back to the aftermath of the V2 missile attacks on the UK during World War II. The radar base allows for three main functions. First, the radar serves as a ballistic missile early warning system. Through an intel sharing agreement, data gathered from the site is shared by both the US and the UK. During the Cold War, this was referred to as the 4-minute warning. Second, it performs the role of enabling space situational awareness through the detection and tracking of orbiting objects in space and is part of the US space surveillance network. So in other words, it performs dual functions in terms of both being an early warning system for ballistic missiles as well as a space surveillance network. Third, it also provides a satellite warning service to the UK in tracking spy satellites. As far as the funding part of the UK's missile defense is concerned, the UK actually funds the NATO missile defense network, although it does not participate in it in an operational capacity. But it also engages in R&D initiatives with the US Missile Defense Agency through the UK's Missile Defense Center. The missile defense arrangement with the US is institutionalized under the umbrella of the UK being a framework partner and includes joint project activities for cooperative R&D projects. Now, with regard to the UK's thinking on missile defense, the most recent or the 2015 National Security Strategy and the Strategic Defense and Security Review, the SDSR, explicitly calls for the need to invest, for the UK to invest in a new ground-based BMD radar, and also calls upon the UK to investigate the potential of Type 45 destroyers to operate in a BMD role. If implemented, both these actions would be a significant departure from the UK's current BMD posture, although no action has been taken as of today. So let me move on to the strategic threat environments that are likely in 2040. So looking far into the future, the strategic threat environment in 2040 is likely to be more diffuse and diverse in scope. The UK is likely to face a more fluid threat environment comprising traditional threats from ballistic missiles, which are expected to proliferate further in an environment which will be a lot more permissive to missile proliferation efforts by states, notwithstanding technology controls that have been imposed by the Missile Technology Control Regime. Moreover, missile defense systems would have to deal with the widespread proliferation of cruise missiles, which they are incapable of addressing in the manner in which they're configured to deal with today. In other words, today's BMD systems only take care of ballistic missiles. They cannot address the threats posed by cruise missiles. Moreover, hypersonic missiles, including boost glide vehicles, which are currently under development and testing, would likely be operationalized by then, perhaps as early as 2030. The natural evolution of BMD systems would need to address such major leaps in technology as those that are on offer, including other systems such as directed energy weapons. Other advanced AI-enabled missiles are likely to see the light of the day by 2040. In other words, these new emerging technologies are likely to play a role in how missiles are going to be delivered in the future. Moreover, the versatility of the maneuverability characteristics inherent in future missile defense systems and the speed with which they can deliver WMD payloads will present a renewed challenge for designers of missile defense platforms. A radical reinvention of the concept of missile defense and how to design, develop, test, and operationalize next-generation defense systems presents the UK with a unique opportunity to rethink future missile defense capabilities in fundamentally new ways. In short, whether it is precision guidance and accuracy, speed, payload capacity, maneuverability, and command and control of next-generation missiles, missile defense systems have their work cut out in dealing with them. By 2040, countries like Iran are expected to further develop precision-guided long-range missile systems that could possibly reach the UK mainland and could become part of Iran's coercive strategic repertoire. I then move on to the drivers for building a robust UK missile defense. First, the state of the international security environment in 2040 is expected to deteriorate, with great power competition set to intensify in the coming decades between the US on one hand and Russia and China on the other. The US has identified both Russia and China as its two major adversaries in its most recent national security strategy. This strategic competition is likely to spill over into Europe. The UK cannot be entirely divorced from this unfolding reality. Second, both Russia and China are developing hypersonic weapons and advanced cruise missiles, which would endanger strategic stability in Europe, particularly if these missiles are tipped with nuclear weapons. Existing NATO missile defense systems are ill-equipped to handle such missiles as the hypersonic and cruise missile threats. Third, emerging technologies such as AI and cyber are set to infiltrate the decision process in nuclear command and control systems, endangering deterrent stability. Finally, the collapse of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, and the impending doubts about extending the New START will pose grave risks to UK's national security. Given the strategic threats looming on the horizon and a bumpy road ahead for strategic arms control, countries such as China are unlikely to join a trilateral arms control dialogue anytime soon. In the wake of these dramatic shifts in the UK strategic environment, the UK security managers would have to fundamentally rethink their current BMD strategy. The nuclear threat landscape in 2040 will look very different from today, and posed new challenges to British nuclear deterrence. I then go on to kind of tease out some of the strategic options available for UK missile defense. In terms of the targets to defend against ballistic missile attacks, the UK would have to determine which of the targets need to be defended on a priority basis. Is the primary threat to the UK mainland primarily to defend the population, military assets of the UK mainland, UK overseas territories, or UK joint expeditionary troops, or protection of allies? So this is going to be a particularly important kind of a decision to make about the target set that needs to be defended against missiles. At the end of the day, population defense is the most difficult target to defend against in a crisis involving missile forces. It's instructive to note in this regard that NATO's missile defense thinking has evolved over the past decade, and NATO's expanded its missile defense target set to move from theater defense exclusively to include population defense as well. I tease out three main strategic options for the UK to consider in its forward-thinking missile defense strategy. First, assemble an independent UK-based consortium of defense partners to develop an indigenous capability and build the technology architecture from the ground up, using domestic technology resources and support from other European partners, and taking into account the unique threat environment facing the UK in 2040. However, this would be prohibitively expensive and time-consuming, but would give a major boost to domestic defense industrial base in the UK. A second option would entail expanding the current partnership agreement with the US Missile Defense Agency and working more closely on the MDA's next generation BMD architecture. A third option would involve working with the UK's European partners as part of the European phased adaptive approach. This would involve building on the existing French Astar family of interceptor missiles. So with that, I would like to move into my concluding remarks. So in conclusion, I would like to state that BMD will become a strategic imperative in the coming decades as the UK's threat spectrum widens and continues to expand in scale and scope. A robust BMD will provide the UK with the ability to deter limited conventional coercive regional missile threats, which may not warrant a full-scale nuclear retaliation. This would further strengthen the domestic defense industrial base and a special relationship with the United States. Finally, a fully integrated air and missile defense system would further improve the transatlantic relationship and cement the UK's commitment to NATO. If the UK needs to avoid the debilitating effects of a costly nuclear arms race that it can ill afford, it would have to evaluate the possibility of building an independent missile defense system, either through the current NATO BMD institutional architecture or independently on its own, with the option to integrate the newly developed system at a later date with the NATO's command and control system based in Germany. Such an endeavor would not only strengthen the UK's national security, but address the long-term security challenges and fortify the shaky NATO alliance. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions during Q&A.
Great presentation, Ramesh. I suppose the real question there is, what's the trade-off between BMD and other capabilities? In particular, what's the opportunity cost of converting Type 45s for the BMD role? So moving quickly on to Lyndon.
So yeah, look, first of all, just want to say a very big thank you to RUSI and particularly to the PONI team for doing a fantastic job of putting this conference together. There's been some really great panels and great presentations. It's a pleasure to join you, and I appreciate this opportunity to share my research. So as you can see, my topic today is nuclear deterrence, the ghost pillar of the NPT, or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I want to start with a shout out to Jen Knox, actually. So Jen is at the Federation, I think she's at the Federation of American Scientists now. She was involved in developing the concept behind this paper, and initially we had thought to write this together, but sadly due to personal reasons, Jen wasn't able to do that. But I do want to give her a hat tip and say this wonderful image of the ghost pillar. That analogy is her work. So hat tip Jen there. So for those in the audience that are maybe of a more technical bent and maybe not so familiar with the arcane goings-on of the NPT edifice and the ghosts that haunt it, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background context to the treaty and talking about why it matters to Euro-Atlantic security and more broadly, and then I'll give you my core arguments up front so that it's really clear what I'm arguing in this paper. So let me just come over here. So the NPT, or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, entered into force since 1970. It's very broadly known as the cornerstone of the global nuclear control regime. Now, what I mean by that is it's the only multilateral treaty that contains a binding obligation regarding nuclear disarmament for the nuclear weapon states. Of course, there is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but at this point, no nuclear armed countries have joined that. So the NPT is, as I said, it's the only multilateral treaty that contains a binding obligation regarding disarmament of nuclear weapons. But it's also the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation regime, by which I mean when you think about efforts to prevent Iran developing nuclear weapons or to roll back the DPRK nuclear weapons program, all of those efforts derive their legal precedent and as a result, their political legitimacy from this treaty. So the NPT has 188 members. There are only 5 countries that are not members. So India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, and South Sudan. And it's very broadly spoken about in terms of 3 pillars. So people talk about the 3 pillars of the NPT, and those are non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses. Now, these pillars are not actually in the text of the treaty, but for more than 3 decades, the entirety of NPT diplomacy and most analysis has been wrapped around the idea of these 3 pillars. And that is to say, for example, that every 5 years, there's a review conference to review progress on implementing the treaty and look ahead to what needs to be done to continue to implement it. And those review conferences have for decades been explicitly organized around these 3 pillars. So the treaty is broadly thought of as encompassing about a grand bargain where states that don't have nuclear weapons agree not to acquire them by any means. States that do have nuclear weapons agree to work for effective measures to advance disarmament and achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons. And all states have the right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, so what I'm doing in this paper is I'm flagging a couple of core challenges to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and talking about why I think they're a problem and what we need to do about them. So looking at those challenges, there are 2 that I'd flagged today. The first of those is that there is an enormous gap between rhetoric and reality when it comes to the issue of disarmament. So yes, at the end of the Cold War and after the Cold War, we've seen fantastic progress on arms control and enormous reductions in the numbers of nuclear warheads and delivery systems. So I think the US figure is 88% warhead reductions and Russia says it's 85 for Russia. But when you look at where we are today, we're in a situation of rising nuclear risks. And what I mean when I say that is that the likelihood of the spread or use of nuclear weapons appears to be increasing. Now, of course, those things run immediately counter to all of the objectives of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which are to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to prevent the use of nuclear weapons and, God forbid, a nuclear war, specifically, and this is in the preamble of the treaty, to prevent the humanitarian suffering that would occur from such a war. So what I argue in this paper is that you won't be surprised to hear that these are not the core problem. In fact, that these core challenges that the NPT faces are the symptoms. And given the title of my paper, you will be unsurprised to hear that what I think the core problem is that there is a ghost in the system and that ghost is called nuclear deterrence. It haunts the NPT edifice. So let me unpack that a little bit. So why do I call it a ghost? Well, as I said, the NPT is wrapped around this idea of 3 pillars, disarmament, non-proliferation, peaceful uses, whereas nuclear deterrence is not a pillar of the NPT, and it's not recognized either in the treaty text or in any of the documents that have been agreed by consensus among NPT states parties. So it does appear in national statements at the NPT conferences. States do talk about the nuclear deterrence posture, but there's been no agreement among NPT parties about the status or legitimacy of nuclear deterrence. And in fact, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated in part explicitly to reject the idea that there's any legitimacy for nuclear deterrence. So there's a real gap there in the positions of NPT parties. Nevertheless, what we find is that deterrence is actually a key theoretical and practical determinant of the nuclear postures of the nuclear weapon states. So whereas the problem that we face is that, just like ghosts, not everyone believes in nuclear deterrence. And by that I mean, if you ask the nuclear weapon states, what they'll say is that extended nuclear deterrence reduces proliferation incentives among allies. It causes international stability, and it therefore is what will be needed to maintain the stability that will in future make disarmament possible. Whereas if you talk to non-nuclear weapon states parties to this treaty, they tend to say that actually nuclear deterrence incentivizes proliferation, precisely because the most powerful countries in the world consistently saying these weapons are essential for our security is giving other states the message that perhaps they should consider acquiring these weapons. So non-nuclear weapon states will argue that nuclear deterrence undermines national and international security, and indeed human security, based on the risks of catastrophic humanitarian harm that would occur from any use of nuclear weapons in a populated area, or indeed through the risk of escalation to nuclear war, which would have catastrophic global consequences. Non-nuclear weapon states will also say that nuclear deterrence encourages arms racing dynamics. So there's a real split there in the membership of the treaty about the status of nuclear deterrence. And so what the problem is, though, that despite the lack of recognition in the NPT context of nuclear deterrence, deterrence still defines what's possible on disarmament and non-proliferation, precisely because deterrence is what determines the postures of nuclear weapon states, and then they bring those postures to NPT meetings, basically as predetermined non-negotiable positions. And that prevents progress on disarmament in ways that the NPT wants to advance disarmament. So in this paper, what I argue is that the NPT lacks the institutional capacity to address the ghost pillar, specifically because there is this great divide between NPT parties. There's no consensus about the status of the practice of deterrence or its legitimacy. And what I argue as a result in political terms is that we need a multilateral dialogue on nuclear deterrence, and specifically to look at the relationships between nuclear deterrence and risk, because the non-nuclear weapon states have a legitimate interest in reducing the likelihood of the use or spread of nuclear weapons, and they believe that that is related to the deterrence postures of the nuclear weapon states. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break that down a little further and look at how the ghost pillar operates in general in the NPT context, and then look at one specific example drawn from the NPT documents to show how it works in the specifics. And then I'm going to wrap up the presentation with some discussion of conceptual problems related to addressing the ghost pillar and political implications, where to from here. So in general terms, what we see in the NPT is that there has been a growing consensus over several decades about the necessity of achieving disarmament. What I mean by that is that every 5 years at the review conferences, NPT parties attempt to develop a consensus statement or outcome document that expresses their perspective on what the treaty means, success to date in implementing the treaty, and where to in future. And over the last 3.5 decades, what we've seen is an increasing frequency and specificity of a consensus among states parties explicitly stated in consensus outcome documents that the NPT creates an obligation to pursue effective measures on disarmament and to achieve disarmament. It's not an obligation to try, it's an obligation to achieve disarmament of nuclear weapons. So the challenge is that even those documents, the status of those documents is now challenged by some nuclear weapon states. But what I'm arguing here is that irrespective of your position on disarmament, so whether you think that disarmament is desirable or even feasible, these consensus documents negotiated painstakingly across 35 years among what's now 188 states parties have created an enormous widespread political expectation of further progress on effective measures to advance disarmament. Now, how does that relate in general to the world we're in today? Well, you know, the world today, we see the end of nuclear reductions, we see the demise of multilateral and bilateral arms control, and we effectively see what looks very much like the start of a qualitative arms race in nuclear weapons and a qualitative technology race in, you know, military applications of dual-use technologies. The nuclear weapon states will say that the result of this environment is that, you know, the environment is not right for further progress on disarmament at present, by which they actually mean, and here's where the ghost pillar comes into play, due to the requirements of nuclear deterrence. So they can't advance disarmament because of their perceptions about what they need to do to maintain credible nuclear deterrence. So taking that down to a specific example, in the 2010 review conference, an action plan was developed for disarmament and non-proliferation and agreed by consensus. And in this, it talks about the need for openness and cooperation in order to advance disarmament. It talks about the need for increased transparency and effective verification as being important for disarmament. And then it wraps these things up and they put these into action point 21. So action 21, NPT parties encourage the nuclear weapon states to adopt standardized reporting forms, by which I mean regular reporting at specific intervals on standardized reporting forms. And then here again, when it gets to the devil being in the detail, they did so, but to do so without prejudice to national security, which of course is an implicit reference to the role that nuclear deterrence plays in their national security strategies. So what we effectively see is that deterrence trumps disarmament, if you'll excuse the pun, given the context that we live in. So what are the conceptual considerations and political implications that arise from this? So turning first to the conceptual considerations, like what does it mean if we truly want to address this problem of the ghost in the system? How are we going to exercise this ghost in order to move towards a world in which relations between political entities is not defined by threats of nuclear annihilation? So the first thing to point out is that nuclear deterrence is a social science theory, not a pure science theory. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the theory of gravity, for example, it might be a little bit wobbly, you know, around the edges, but pretty much like I pick up my pen and I drop it and 10 times out of 10, it falls. The same is not necessarily true of nuclear deterrence because nuclear deterrence is a social theory. And that is to say that unlike deterrence, unlike gravity, belief is required for nuclear deterrence to work. And in that sense, deterrence is kind of like money. That is, so for deterrence to work, you know, adversaries have to believe that our threats are credible. In order to make those threats credible, we have to constantly reinforce the perception in our adversaries that we will in fact carry out the nuclear threats that we make. We have to also convince our allies that we'll carry out those threats. So there's this assurance and kind of credibility game going on constantly. And the idea is that without that constant reassurance about the credibility of those threats, the threats reduce in credibility. And as they do, the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons is decreased. So in that sense, Benoit Pelopidas at Sciences Po calls that the double work of deterrence. It works partly because of the work we do to make it work. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the implications of that for critical analysis, that it's partly based on our belief in the value of nuclear deterrence, that nuclear deterrence has value. I would say that to exercise the ghost pillar, we are going to need, and therefore, to stop believing in deterrence. If we want to achieve disarmament, at some point, we have to stop believing that deterrence reinforces security. And we also need to problematize the relationship between disarmament and arms control, by which I mean not all arms control is necessarily good for disarmament. I've only got 30 seconds left, so I'm going to turn very quickly to the political implications of all of this. So as I said, I argue that we need a global dialogue on the relationship between nuclear deterrence and nuclear risk. Here are some venues that might take place in: the N5 process, the C&D process led by the United States, or the Stockholm Initiative. My personal hobby horse that I love, the Global Commission on Military Nuclear Risks, which I'm happy to say more about in Q&A because I'm out of time now. And just to leave with a slightly provocative note, we need the political will for disarmament. And in my world, that means show me the money. Like, if you want disarmament, what are you willing to invest in terms of developing the conceptual sophistication that we're going to need to move in that direction? And are we willing to spend nuclear weapons into oblivion?
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. The tension between nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament that you highlight links nicely with the yes or no minister exercise we'll be running later today. So let's move on to the final presentation of this panel. Thomas, over to you.
My name is Tom Davis. Today I'll be talking on playing the China card, so the national security implications of using the UK Hualong One nuclear power station. I'm a director of nuclear engineering consultant at Davis and Musgrove Limited. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Oxford, and I'm an officer cadet in the Oxford University Royal Naval Unit for Naval Reserves. I'll first start off the disclaimer that everything I discuss in this presentation is a reflection of my opinions only, and they do not reflect any of the affiliations I mentioned before and any I'm part of in the future. A quick outline, quite simple, 3 points: playing the China card, the nuclear power station, and then the implications of one. Before that, I thought I would show some pictures to give you context. This is a Russian gas pipeline. It's pretty basic. You can turn it off and it stops, and there's no implications of that from a physical or from an environmental perspective. This is a gas-fired power station. Again, you can turn it off and it's pretty instant, and the effects are clear, and again, no environmental impacts per se. This is a nuclear power station. This is actually Sizewell B, the dome, the concrete dome. You see the white dome is Sizewell B, pressure water reactor. One simply doesn't turn one off. Once you start the chain reaction for uranium, it's difficult to stop, but also has major implications for the environment around it. So it's not as simple as that. And to give you perspective, this is a photo of me on holiday in China. What it really is the perspective of size of a nuclear reactor. There's two in the background. There's a Diabay nuclear power station. There's actually 6 reactors at this site. 2 are in the background. But this is to give you some perspective of, people talk about Russian gas pipeline. It's pretty simple and easy concept to turn on and off. Nuclear power station, not so much. What do I mean by playing the China card? It really comes from a quote actually from the nuclear energy director from the China Atomic Energy Authority back in 2016. And he said, nuclear energy is, as I quote, an important cornerstone of strategic power, a vehicle for civilian military integration, and a China card to play in the country's international cooperation diplomacy. And I'll allude to that more in the future about what that really means or what that could be signified. So I'll quickly give a background of, today, 2020, the Chinese domestic nuclear market. So on the left of this graph is all the sites in China with nuclear power stations, and then at the x-axis is the year of construction. Green reflects currently operating, and purple reflects the ones which are under construction. The point really being, there's a lot under construction in China right now. So this kind of gives you the idea of why China can export nuclear reactors and why are they being considered in the UK. So there's 5 main reasons why you can export reactors from China. 1, the construction rate domestically provides economics of scale and there's a large skilled workforce. Number 2 is that there is an intrinsic assumption that China can reduce the cost of reactor construction. Worldwide competitors, so there's mainly 3. Westinghouse in the United States went bankrupt a couple of years ago. Arriva and EDF are combined. They're the French reactor design company. They have some financial challenges right now. And Rosatom, the Russian state-backed nuclear export company, provide financial support. However, there's been some reduction in the Russian economy, and there's questions whether they can actually fulfill those orders in the future. China has large financial reserves, and it's a state-backed enterprise. Generally, when it's state-backed and there's political will with it, it will be completed regardless of the cost. That kind of gives you why China are exporting today, or they want to export today. So the second part of this talk will discuss the UK Hualong One nuclear power station. Hualong One is just a reference to the reactor design name. And I'll take a step back quickly and kind of give you kind of a background on current nuclear energy in the UK of the new build. So this is a picture of Somerset, and this is Hinkley Point. So Hinkley Point A is in the center, which is actually a Magnox reactor, and they're decommissioning right now. B on the right is an advanced gas reactor that's currently operating, and C is the one you hear in the newspaper, which is Hinkley Point C. This is the current latest photo of it. The reason I present this is really to give you a sense of scale. This is one of the 2 nuclear reactors to be constructed. What you're actually seeing is the pit, is the concrete bottom where it actually sits upon. There'll be 2, and they will provide about 7% of UK power. And I'll give you basically an overview of what 2020 looks like right now with UK nuclear power of new build. This is all new build. We're not discussing the ones which are currently operating. So I mentioned Hinkley Point C, so they recognize it as HPC. So in 2015, the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, and President Xi Jinping signed this agreement called the Strategic Investment Agreement. And essentially what it allows is that EDF Energy, who are providing the reactor design, so we're not discussing that about Hualong One, this is a different reactor, 66.5% will be funded by EDF Energy, and 33.5% will be funded by CGN, which is China General Nuclear, which is the state-backed export company, and they build domestically in China. Part of this deal, David Cameron allowed Sizewell C, which is here. This is the next power station to be under construction in the UK, and it's a carbon copy of Hinkley Point C from France, from EDF Energy. But 20% will be funded by CGN, 80% by EDF Energy. That's what it states. The funding hasn't actually been announced yet of what's actually going to happen. This news article on the right was 27th of May this year, by the way. But what we're really talking about today is this plant here, which is at Bradwell B. So again, part of this deal for allowing the Chinese to invest in the nuclear reactors in our country is that they will be allowed to submit and construct Hualong One nuclear reactor at Bradwell site, which is approximately 60 miles from London. So the first point from this talk is every single nuclear reactor design in the UK to be built in the UK must go through the Office for Nuclear Regulation, which is the UK's nuclear regulator, generic design assessment, which is essentially a 4-step program which will scrutinize the reactor core design or the reactor design in its generic form, so not site-specific, and it will give basically a approval to be allowed to construct in the UK, i.e. your reactor is safe to be built in the UK for X amount of years, generally 60 years they're going to be operating for. So it's this stamp of approval. So my first point, and it will come clear a bit later why that is, in my assessment, the Chinese government, which is CGN in this case, because they're state-backed, they are owned by the Chinese government, 100%, is using the UK nuclear regulatory stamp of approval, i.e. this GDA process I mentioned, as a catalyst to launch their nuclear export program. What I mean by that is the upcoming markets, if you look for the nuclear export program in the world today, you focus on Africa, South America, and the Middle East. If you can come to these countries with your reactor and say it is safe, what better not than having the UK approve it to be built in the UK. So this sort of approval will launch the beginnings of the Chinese nuclear power export industry. And if you could think about it, the actual return of investment from Hinkley Point C, from Chinese investment, is actually quite small in comparison to the potential of an export of their program. So that's kind of like Hualong One, kind of where it sits, but what are the actual national security implications for the UK specifically? And this is the kind of the part of the talk. So it's not new, recent news article. So this is the Financial Times from 2018 in October. The US have been warning the UK against the alliances we are building between the Chinese companies and the UK. US blacklist Chinese nuclear power companies over theft of military technology and also from nuclear secrets in the US, which I'll discuss a bit further. And then also there's some calls, from the Financial Times. This was about a week ago about that the government should fund the nuclear power stations rather than China. So before I go into the actual implications, I'll just present the facts as they are. So number one is the UK Hualong One power station will operate for a 60-year lifetime near London. It is designed for 60 years, and that's how the license will give. Number two, if you actually run the numbers, China will have a significant investment into the UK power grid, approximately 24% by 2030 if all the nuclear power stations are built on time. In 2015, this is a direct quote from the US Justice Department, Alan Ho is being held accountable for enlisting listed US-based nuclear experts to provide assistance in developing and producing special nuclear material in China for a Chinese state-owned nuclear company, i.e. CGN paid Alan Ho to steal Westinghouse nuclear secrets and have shown that these actual secrets have been aiding the Chinese military developments. Number 4, US Department last year in 2019, Department of Commerce actually blacklisted China General Nuclear and all the related companies to do with that trade. Hualong One is a nuclear reactor design. And also Hualong One is in its current last stage of the PGA step process I mentioned back in the past. Here is a news article from February this year, which just announced the completion of step 3. I have experience with step 3 because I used to work for Hitachi, where I worked with the O&O on going through step 3 as an engineer. So they're near to the end, so it's going to be about 1 more year before they get approval from the regulator to allow construction in the UK. The construction wouldn't start until its funding's approved, etc. Some sort of analysis on this. So and this is my analysis. You know, it's been clear in the news that China has shown its use economic levers as a political tool to advance the Chinese Communist Party. And remember, in this context, the nuclear reactor we're talking about has a 60-year lifetime, so you're at least having a 60-year economic entanglement with China. CGN, China General Nuclear, have been caught in espionage-type acts against the US nuclear industry. China have stated that nuclear power is part of its military civil fusion strategy, and this is that quote I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll bring it up in the end. They've already said they will do this. This obviously could affect that special relationship we have with the United States, and outsource nuclear expertise. And I would refer you back to the panel yesterday on sustaining nuclear expertise. The fact that a lot of our new build nuclear power stations will come from outside the country tells you something about our expertise within the country as well. And number 6, and it's quite pertinent right now, actually the coronavirus pandemic has reminded us that foreign nations do not necessarily have the UK best interest in mind. What are possible implications, national security implications of this? You know, in conjunction with the recent British government decision, you know, allowing Huawei to build part of the UK 5G network, the UK Nuclear Civil Partnership with CGN will further deepen that economic entanglement that could be used for Chinese political purposes with greater frequency. I'll allude a bit more on that in a second. There's it could be a reduction of British agency when challenged abroad in Chinese and Chinese Communist Party strategic assertions, for example, their assertions in the South China Sea. As I mentioned, the outsourcing of nuclear expertise could actually jeopardize the defense nuclear industry due to the lack of sustainable, suitably qualified and experienced personnel, or in other words, SWEP, availability. This will create and deepen the UK economic geopolitical dependency on China. And on Sunday last week, the Sunday Times published this article, China threats to pull the plug on new nuclear power stations. I wrote these slides before Sunday, but things I would highlight. So the Chinese ambassador to UK on Sunday privately fired a warning shot at the government, UK government, telling business leaders that abandoning the Huawei deal could undermine plans for Chinese companies to build nuclear power plants and HS2 high-speed rail network. And yesterday, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, there was an article released, criticized China. Specifically, he actually said, Pompeo said that the US was ready to assist Britain with whatever is needed after Beijing reportedly threatened to punish HSBC Bank and break its commitments to build nuclear power stations in the country, and that is Hualong One nuclear power station. That's exactly what they're talking about. If the UK do not allow Chinese technology firm Huawei to build its 5G network. So I would summarize, and only thing to take away from this slide is this. So remember back at the beginning, I said that the Nuclear Energy Director from the China Atomic Energy Authority stated that nuclear energy is an important cornerstone of strategic power and a vehicle for civilian military integration, and there's China card to play in the country's international cooperation diplomacy. Now, my first point was about how they're using the UK to launch a reactor program abroad, and also my point 2 is the CGN involvement in the UK could jeopardize US special relationship, reduce the agency of the UK in CCP related activities, and also create and deepen the UK economic and geopolitical dependency on China. And moreover, if you read that quote again and look at what China have done in the last week, they are, if they interfere country international cooperation diplomacy as trying to strong arm the UK to allow the Huawei deal to go through. If the UK do not allow Huawei, they'll pull out all their cards on nuclear energy. So is that the strategic power they're talking about? And that's up for judgment, and we'll see how it plays in the future. And that's why I mentioned, is this the card they're trying to play to force through the Huawei deal? So I'll end it there. Thank you.